This is an ABC podcast.
This week on Conversations, we're bringing you 5 of our favourite shows of the year. And today, it's my conversation with Lindy Lee. Our thinking minds like to tell us that we can have a plan for life, that we can be in control of how it all turns out. But when you step back a little, it might become clear just how much is up to chance, to forces beyond our intellectual understanding. And in fact, this not knowing can actually be wonderfully liberating and spacious. Lindy Lee embraces the energy of not knowing in her work as an artist and in her life as a Zen practitioner. As a little girl growing up in Brisbane in the 1950s and 60s, Lindy always felt different. It took her many years to find the power and meaning in that difference. Hi, Lindy.
Hi, Sarah.
You work with different materials in your artwork, including bronze. Tell me where you go to do that, to handle the bronze.
Oh, I go to Urban Art Projects, which is actually a very large factory on the outskirts of Brisbane. And they have a wonderful foundry and they let me play around with molten bronze, which is kind of dangerous and wonderful.
When you say molten bronze, how hot is it?
1,200 plus degrees centigrade.
So what do you have to wear to keep yourself safe?
Thank you for asking. No, I love the ritual of leathering up. So I've got to wear leather trousers, apron, jacket, this snood, this kind of hood that you have to pull over your head, plus these goggles and this mask and these huge gloves. So I look like a kind of polar bear by the end of the dress up.
And the bronze is bubbling away inside its kiln. What's it like at the moment that you open the lid?
That's an amazing moment because the sound of the foundry actually permeates the entire factory. So there's this low hum. And as soon as you open up the lid, it goes and then whoosh. And it's just like, it's very dramatic. And then all these sparks and this redness, this glowingness just emanates. And it's time to start.
And what do you do next? What's the process?
Normally I've spent a couple of minutes just quietening myself because it's for a number of reasons. Because A, because it's a meditation practice for me. And B, if I'm not quiet in myself, it's very dangerous. Okay, so if one little drop of bronze drops onto the surface of what I'm wearing, it can burn straight through and, it burns straight through to bone. So you have to be very careful.
And once you have you've had your moment of quiet and you've got a ladle full of bronze, what do you do?
Well, I kind of receive the ladle. It's very heavy. It can be up to 15 kilos. And then I kind of have to, it's hard to describe, but it's from the moment I receive the ladle. It's just however I am in that stance is going to dictate how the rest of my body is going to flow to toss the bronze. So it's kind of like from the moment my hands are on the ladle, the trajectory of the toss is already determined, not by me, but just by circumstance.
So you don't go in with a particular plan for what you want the shape to be?
I can't. I mean, what do? Anybody tried tossing a glass of water and trying to determine the shape? It doesn't happen that way. And that's the whole point. And the practice is actually based on this ancient Buddhist calligraphy technique called flung ink. And what the practitioner would do was sit quietly, meditate, to quiet and still the mind, and then take up a flask of ink and then just toss it onto paper or silk. And it was understood absolutely that the resulting mark is the condensation, the distillation of absolutely everything that has happened in that moment. Everything in the universe in that moment has conspired to make that mark.
You went and studied calligraphy in China. Is that where you learned this technique?
Sort of. Okay, so the funny thing is that, I am Chinese and I felt I had a duty, and especially as an artist, then I should go and study calligraphy. Seemed to make sense. So I managed to get an Asia Link fellowship, and I found a studio in Beijing, found a calligraphy master who was absolutely fantastic. He was saying all the right things that a young Zen student wanted to hear. You know, that this is the good stroke and this is the bad stroke. The bad stroke is bad because it's all over the place. It is not focused. It's not concentrated. It's just chatter, chatter, chatter. The good stroke is just this, you know. So he was saying all of these wonderful words to me and I'm soaking it up. And then I take all my tools away and I grind the ink and it's all a process. And I love this. And about 4 seconds after I begin, this huge, like, no, mustn't, can't, shouldn't. And I'm going, what? I've just, I won this fellowship for 5 months. I'm supposed to be studying calligraphy.
The no came from within you?
Yeah, it was an absolute, complete prohibition. It's like, no. It's like, it was incalcitrant. It was just like, no. You must not do this. And I went, if I could swear on radio, but I screamed. I said, what the is that about? But I do have these kind of intuitive responses, and I guess there's this place of not knowing. And when that no or that thing rears its head, I have to listen. I've just learned over decades. And then I have to unpack the no.
What did the calligraphy master make of your strong intuitive no?
Didn't understand it. Because I'd upfront paid for the classes and stuff, and in conversation, clearly I was understanding something. So he was very surprised that I couldn't continue. But what ended up happening was I then started to splash paint, and I was thinking, but this feels authentic. And I was thinking, so I'm having this 5-month argument with myself, splashing paint, going, why is this more valid than learning my strokes, my calligraphy strokes? And I quite like repetitive work. So it's not about, the boredom or anything like that. It was just like, no, it mustn't do it. Anyway, on my second last night in Beijing on that trip, I met up with a young artist. And he was Chinese, and he was showing me his work, and he was saying that this was really Chinese, and I kept thinking when he was describing his work that it was traditional calligraphy, painting of flowers and streams, and that sort of thing. But when he showed me his work, it was scenes from nightclubs and lots of dancing and partying, and I said, that's interesting, but why do you call it traditional? Because the subject matter isn't. And he just held up his brushes and he said, this is the tradition. So his work was evolving from Chinese watercolour, and somehow in that second, I just realised this wasn't my tradition. We may be genetically Chinese together, but my background and my relationship with Chinese art history is very different to his. And that was why this huge no came up. I said, no, this is not your tradition as it is. I have to reinvent it.
Paying attention to the way things look, the nature of shape and of colour, the play of light. How early on in your life, Lindy, do you remember taking notice of that sort of thing?
Oh, I remember when I was 3 years old, and we lived in Kangaroo Point in Brisbane, and it was an old Queenslander house that we had. And I remember lying on the veranda on my tummy, and there were shafts of sunlight streaming onto the veranda, and looking up and just seeing these dust motes just dancing merrily in the sunlight. And as a child, when you first see something and it is pure magic. And I remember that moment, and I just remember thinking, because I was drawing at the time, I was thinking, oh, if only I could draw that. And in some weird way, after more than 60 years, I'm finally doing it.
So your impulse right there from the start was wanting to make a record of that, or to make a response to it? What's the impulse, do you think?
Good question. I think what I wanted to record was that moment of engagement when it becomes magical. When you have, instead of an intellectual experience of something, you have this direct experience of something that is really vivid and true, and you can't describe it. I wanted to capture that. And something in the absolute direct and immediate connection with those dancing dust motes, I kind of think in retrospect carved my career.
You say you started off life in an old Queenslander at Kangaroo Point. What kind of images do you have in your head about life inside that home?
Oh, it was probably orderly chaos. So I have very vivid memories of my mum cooking all the time, of the old Ringer washing machine, which she thought was just the most fantastic thing, even though, today, of course, it still means quite a lot of work. I remember my dad making furniture in his workshop in the backyard because he had a furniture factory. I remember Mum with my sister strapped to her back, painting the backs of glasses to make mirrors. Dad was making furniture and he was making these buffets, and the glass was actually for the backs of the buffets. So it was that kind of childhood where Mum was just always there, and there was just the sort of the chaos of that interaction, all that working.
And did you speak Cantonese at home as a little girl?
I think before I started to go to school, I spoke mostly in Cantonese, but as soon as I started to go to school, I lost it. Pretty quickly, because my parents, because they were talking about a time in the 50s, and Australia is still very much entrenched in the white Australia policy. And my parents and a lot of immigrant families felt this way too, that it was better not to take up my mother tongue because they felt that was going to make life harder for me if I was bilingual. It's a bit weird to think that way, but when there's a lot of prejudice about and you want to protect your children, that's what you do.
So were you aware from an early age then that the way other families looked and behaved in those other houses around you was maybe quite different from what was happening at your home?
Yeah, I think I was, because it was the experiences within the family are just different if you're from a migrant family. But I do remember, actually, now that you bring it up, Sarah, that the people I loved most were the Italian family who lived next door, curiously. I remember vividly swapping Maria's penne with Mum's black bean sauce, beef and rice stuff, over the fence. It was that typical inter-migrant interaction.
They're two very good trades on both sides,
I think we all won.
Take me back to your parents' story, Lindy. How did your mum and dad first see one another?
I love this story. So the story goes, my mum loves the story too. So apparently my mum's sister had eaten too many cakes and had a stomachache. So my mum was sent down to the herbalist to pick up some stomach herbs. And then as she was running towards the herbalist, she heard some music from a gramophone. And she looked up, and in that moment she saw a man who looked down at her, and their eyes met, and that was that moment. And then the next day, Mum says that man came and she was asked to serve tea with him and his uncle. And afterwards, my mum's mum then said, you like that man? And I always have to do the Chinese accent. She said, you like that man? And my mum says, him quite good looking. Him okay. And then her mother says, you want to marry him? And she say, well, okay. Seem okay. But that was it. And then they got engaged and they stepped out for a year and then they got married.
How old was your mum then, Lindy?
About 19. So it was one of those stories of, it's a movie. She looks up, he looks down, eyes lock. Who is this mysterious person? Dad tries to find his Cinderella and he finds her.
What sort of life did your mum expect or would have been expected after marriage back then?
Both my parents came from relatively well-off landowning. They were farming people, but they were landowners, so they had wealth of some kind. Mum loves to contrast her life before the war came and everything was lost. So before then, my mum says, she just played mahjong all day. She just, everybody come feed her, nothing to do, everything to play, So that was the life that she was expecting, and it was not the life that she was eventually to live out.
Well, what changed for them when war broke out in China?
Well, Japanese invasion, that was a pretty harsh thing. It was World War II. China was in turmoil. It was about to go into revolution. There was no money. There was huge poverty. And my grandfather had been in Australia for a number of decades. But at some point he decided that it was time for him to return. So when he decided to return to China, it was then possible for him to kind of nominate unofficially who could replace him. And my father decided that it should be him. So my dad should come and replace his father-in-law. And that was a really important decision in the life of my family. But it was also, I think, very, very hard for my mum, because I just always remember this photograph, and I've used this photograph in my work, and it's of my parents, my mother and my father, my oldest brother, and my mother's sister. But in the photograph, my mum is 6 months pregnant. And it's a really poignant photograph because it's the day that Dad is about to step off China onto a boat and come to Australia. And every time I see that photograph, I can only think what it would be like to be a woman, to be 6 months pregnant, to say goodbye to your husband, when you know that revolution is imminent, and not to know how long it will be, if ever, you're ever going to see your husband again. And to give birth to another child in that situation. That's incredible.
How did your mum help support her family financially after your dad came to Australia?
I think my mother is one of the most brilliant people who's ever walked this planet. She became a gold trader, as you do.
What did that entail?
Oh, well, I think one of her uncles used to go, I don't know, it was a black market or something, would sort of, and somehow, secret my mum into these gold dens. Anyway, Mum just says, I just look and I just learn up and down gold, up and down, up and down. I just learn, I sell then or I buy then, and so she just learned to trade gold. And so over time she accumulated quite a lot of gold.
How did she carry it about on the streets? As you say, revolution is happening. It would be dangerous even in peacetime.
So my mum got her cousin to make a suitcase with a false bottom, which is like hilarious. Well, it gets even more hilarious because she manages to take this suitcase eventually from China, from Guangzhou into the new territories in Hong Kong.
How did she use that gold to help save your grandmother?
One of the things about being the daughter-in-law of a Chinese family, it was understood that you were the slave of your mother-in-law. So Mum's duty when she married Dad and when Dad left for Australia was to look after her mother-in-law. But by this time the revolution was in full swing. And so my grandmother, her mother-in-law, was imprisoned by the Chinese communists because she'd been of a landowning class and sort of disreputable. And, in that time, my grandmother was actually tortured, so she was hung up by her thumb and her big toe and beaten. Anyway, Mum had enough gold to bribe the guards, and eventually my grandmother was released.
When your mum decided she needed to leave China, that it was too dangerous, how did she make her way out with these two young boys?
My mother very cleverly forged a letter from her uncle in Hong Kong. The letter said something like, "My niece is needed urgently in Hong Kong for whatever business. It's a matter of life and death." And she forged this letter. She hired a trishaw driver to take her to the border, and she presented this document to the border officials, and she was let through with my two brothers and this, suitcase of gold.
And then she finds herself in Hong Kong, still without your dad. Where did she live?
For a long time, she lived on the shop floor of her uncle's place. So that would mean getting up before dawn every morning and tidying things up so that the shop could open for the day, and just spending the days like that until eventually Dad could find a way to bring Mum and my two brothers to Australia.
As you say, Lindy, this is extraordinary strength and will and talent that you see now as an adult. Were you aware of that growing up, that kind of heroic nature of your mum's backstory, or was she just Mum?
Well, of course she was just Mum, but the thing is that as I grew and grew older and became more reflective about my parents, I began to see actually how strong she was. She didn't speak a lot, but through her actions, somehow she embodied and demonstrated the best way to hold your life. And even though you will never get everything that you desire, not everything that you even need, Mum always demonstrated capacity to embrace it and to turn it around. So she just has this willful, it's not even optimism, it's pragmatism and joy.
Tell me about the rooftop garden she created, which seems an illustration of what you're describing.
Yes, I love this story. This sums Mum up so perfectly. We lived in St Lucia for my teenage years. Mum and Dad built a block of units, and we lived on top of this block of units, and there was this big rooftop, and Mum made this garden, and she was so proud of it. So one of the things that she loved and continues to love is gardening, and it was her pride and joy, and it was her solace. Dad was a very difficult person, very patriarchal. He really did try to put Mum down. Anyway, he was both jealous and proud of the fact that she had created such a beautiful garden. Part of his criticism was, he would criticise her and say, oh, the tenant underneath are complaining about the water, too much water, breaking up the cement, all this sort of stuff. It was partially correct, but in truth he was also niggling at her, trying to kind of break her a little bit. So one day he just said, garden have to go. You have to destroy the garden. He was really strong about this. And I saw Mum sort of crumple and go into a very dark corner for about 30 seconds. After about 30 seconds, she came out and she said, okay, I only got one thing to say. Cactus. I gonna make the cactus garden. No water. You can't complain. Okay? That's Mum.
And I bet she made the best cactus garden ever.
She made the best cactus garden ever. It was her pride and joy. There was no way in the world that just because she wasn't told that she couldn't have a garden, she would just make it happen anyway.
So you have this strong, creatively independent mother and a father who it sounds had pretty strict ideas about who should be in charge. What was expected of you growing up?
I think that Dad was actually very disappointed that I was, I'm going to say this, as bright as Mum, because he loved Mum, but he didn't appreciate her capacity to shine, and he didn't like my capacity to shine. So he tried to school it out of me. Well, no, he was a bit tougher than that, actually. He'd set up things like he wanted me to marry a Malaysian dentist at one point, till my sister very gently said, Lindy, I don't know, not going to work, Dad, just think about it. And finally Dad gave up. He just wanted me to be, to have a traditional life.
How were you pushing back against that?
Well, you become rebellious for a start, but, I wasn't a rebel in any outrageous sense. But I had a very strong sense of what was just. So justice was really important to me, and fairness. So instead of pushing me down as he tried to do, it just gave me grist for the mill. I just wanted to not be the best. I didn't even know what I wanted to be, but I knew that being told to be other than what you are was not right. And I guess that's his gift to me, that I don't know, he gave me the reason to step up to myself.
You love drawing and been drawing since you were such a little girl. Were there women artists that you saw around you or looked up to and thought, okay, this is a model of what I might be?
You know, I tried for the first 10 years after I left high school not to be an artist. Mostly, in fact, entirely, because there were no women artists on my horizon. There was Betty Churcher, she was my art history lecturer, and there was Davida Allen. We're talking in Queensland. But we're just talking two possible role models to deny history, you know, in the face of history. So I found it really, really hard to come to terms with my desire to be an artist.
You trained as a graphic designer. What kind of work did you get after finishing that?
Oh, I didn't finish graphic design. I splendidly failed. Because the graphic design was not graphic design like we would think of it now. Graphic design was just doing very black and white drawings of things like irons, toasters, hair dryers, stoves.
What, for advertising?
Yeah, for advertising. So, you know, so in the Daily Telegraph or whatever, you get this fold out of, you know, what was on special, and an artist or a graphic artist would have drawn, no photographs, you've drawn this. So that was called graphic design, and it was as boring, as boring, as boring. So I failed.
Podcast, broadcast, and online. This is Conversations with Sarah Konoski. Find out more about the Conversations podcast. Just head to abc.net.au/conversations.
Lindy, you say growing up there was no model for you of how to be an artist as a woman, and you didn't kind of think it was possible. What painting did you see in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence that changed your mind?
Yeah, it was a wonderful moment. So I'd left Australia and was seeing the world. And I really was, this one part of me, and I was really, really struggling with the idea or trying to commit myself or even entertain the idea that I could be a painter, because I just didn't think that women could do it. I mean, I didn't say that, but every fibre in my being had been told that. Anyway, I was in the Uffizi, and I remember sort of walking down and just being engrossed in these incredible paintings, and then being very attracted to this particular painting of a woman beheading a man. And I thought, oh, that's so brutal and that's so fascinating. Anyway, I went to have a look at it, and I looked down and I read the label, and the painting was by Artemisia Gentileschi, and I realised that it was a woman who'd painted it. And not only had a woman painted it, but it was an incredible painting. And somehow in that moment, I mean, it took a little bit of time, but there dropped the seed that said, you know, it is possible that you could be an artist, Lindy, because this person did it.
And the story of that woman artist is incredible too, her life story.
Yeah, Artemisia, she was an incredible painter, but she was also raped. And instead of her accuser being put on the stand, she was put on the stand, and she had to defend herself. And to prove the accusation of that she had been raped was true, she was tortured to make sure she was telling the truth. so, and that gives you some idea of why her paintings are quite so visceral. She was really expressing her own experience. And the more you look at those works and the more you understand her story, the more you think how powerful this woman was.
There were probably quite a few men she would have liked to have beheaded.
Totally. Understanding where she's coming from.
You then spent some time at art school in London, and this was in the 1970s. So were you a punk, Lindy Lee?
My nephew Nick would like to think I was. No, my boyfriend at the time was.
Why didn't punk stick with you?
Look, whatever people think of me or artists do, I live a very quiet life. I didn't go out to gigs a lot. I never really did. I used to be notorious for going to all these parties for about 10 minutes. So, I would go there, make sure those people who needed to see me saw me, and I would just back out at 100 miles an hour. I don't know. It's just not me. That's all.
You came back to Australia, and this is then in the 1980s, and you've talked now just about thinking differently about how a woman might be a painter and the legitimacy of a woman being in that role. What about this other element of your identity of being a Chinese Australian? How did you start reconfiguring that part of who you are in your work?
The thing that is really important to me about being an artist is that I feel, not everybody feels this, but I feel you have to deeply explore your darkest wound. It sounds like a cliche, but you really have to go to that place that you don't want to go to. And for most of my life, because I can be entertaining and I can be articulate and all these sorts of things, I could cover up the deep shame that I felt at being Chinese. And I remember, I'd finished art school back in Australia, and my work was very quickly taken up. But first of all, people would find it odd when they'd meet me and say, "Oh, you're Chinese." Oh, yeah, and that was okay and fine. But I was absolutely in denial. I did not want to be Chinese. The last thing in the world I wanted to do was acknowledge my ancestry. Because I wanted to be understood as being Western and as much as possible, almost white. That sounds horrible, doesn't it? And I'm glad it does. It means I've grown. Anyway, so I'd been making these works and they'd been taken up, and for some reason I was invited to speak at a conference about Australia's relationship with Asia, because it must have been around the Keating time when Asia was opening out. So I was invited to talk about me being Chinese and an artist. And I just kept thinking, I don't want to, I'm not Chinese like that. I'm not, blah, blah, blah. And then I was speaking and I was on the podium and I was talking and I was saying, the reason I'm mining Western art history in my work is because I want to declare that my horizon is Western, my allegiance is Western, that I belong to the West. And as soon as those words came out of my mouth, that I want to declare that I belong to the West, I just realised, bugger, I don't. Because if you have to declare, you don't belong at all, because if you belong, you never even question. And the fact that I actually had to make a space for me to belong, and that profoundly in that moment, that billiard ball just flicked to another trajectory.
Would the audience looking at you, listening to you, had any idea that you just had this epiphany?
No, they would just thought I would probably be a brat of some kind, I don't know.
But it pulled you up short.
It pulled me up short, and I realised that I had to go deeply, and I had to realise I had to actually understand that the reason I wanted to be Western was because I was ashamed of my Chineseness.
So what did you do once you'd had that kind of, as you say, dark, painful realisation?
Instead of using my art history, I was using a lot of images, like Artemisia Gentileschi, I used a lot of her work. Instead of using these quite deliberate references to Western art history, I decided to look at my own family. So then I plundered the family photograph albums and then started to use these images. And I guess what I was beginning to do was interrogate the transition, that my family made from China to Australia, from one culture to another, the sorts of ambitions, heartaches, everything about that.
What are some of the photos that you plundered, that you saw? What stand out for you as images that really spoke to you strongly?
I remember photographs of my sister and I playing at the Gold Coast in a Chinese restaurant, things at the Chinese club, which I both hated and loved because I both felt I belonged and didn't belong. Actually, that's a good question, Sarah, because I think it was the photographs where I felt the split somehow. In retrospect, I mean, of course, at that time, I was just going for photographs that attracted me.
Tell me about your nephew, Ben, and how he inspired one of the most important works.
One of the interesting characteristics of being a Lee is cancer. Curiously, all of us, every single one of us, my parents, all my siblings, have had cancer. And my nephew Ben got cancer. And unfortunately, it was a cancer that was incurable. When he died, and he was 22 at the time, I decided to make a work called Birth and Death. And it was it was comprised of 100 accordion books. And on the accordion books was a print. Each book was sort of dedicated to a member of the family at different phases of their life. And if you can imagine that these books are sort of unwound and set up, and it's like wave after wave, these accordions, wave after wave of family. And what I wanted to do for Ben, because the grief was so profound, I mean, when somebody young in the family dies, it is a very, very different thing. So what I wanted to do was somehow give Ben a place in the family, in the various tumultuous and hugely enriching transitions the family has had to do over 5 generations to come to Australia. And it's an important work just because it maps that for me. And it honours Ben, and I'm hoping it honours the lives of everybody in that grouping.
Your partner Rob took a photo of you with the work when it was shown at Campbelltown Art Gallery. What does it look like, that photograph?
So it's a photograph of me sitting in the installation called Birth and Death. So there are about 100 red and black accordion books that are surrounding me, and they're all this sort of face after face, wave after wave of images of people in my family. And it could be my grandmother of when she was 82 or when she was 43, or Ben when he was 6 months old, and maybe when he was 20, just before he got really sick. So there's just this massive sea of faces. And in the middle of it, I'm sitting in Zazen, or Zen meditation, with my Zen robes on. And basically on that day, it was the opening day, and I just decided that rather than attend the opening, I'd just sit. So I sat in meditation for the entire day. So my husband, Rob, was there, and he came and took a photograph of it.
When you mention Zen meditation and this image, in that shift where you decided that you were going to face this fact of your heritage and the history, incredible histories and culture and learning of the East as opposed to the West, and you began practicing as a Zen student, how did that impact the way you were thinking about self and identity? What shifted once you began studying Zen around that struggle?
The way I came to Zen, a lot of people who take up this practice, not everybody, but a lot of it, you're going through some difficulty and some hugely deep questioning about yourself, the validity of who and what you are. Who are you? So I've been going through the struggle for a very long time. And in Zen, though, the question is a beautiful one in this moment. It's not just who you are, but what is it that you are? So with the study of Zen, it's not just who am I, and it's not questions of identity, like me trying to describe that I am 5'4", that I'm Chinese, all this stuff we know. So questions of identity are all about shoring up everything we know about each other or self. In Zen, that question explodes. It's not what you know of, you, but to consider this self as this project that is constantly unfolding. The more you engage with the world, the more the world changes you and you change the world. It's this interface. Self is this interface between the interface of experience, And so this was really liberating. I didn't have to any longer look for an identity, something exactly perfectly fitting this as an outfit or whatever, but rather it became this really glorious question, well, what is it that I am in this moment? And it endlessly unfolds. And so it becomes enriching and it becomes expansive. And the boundaries of what you are through meditation, you understand, are not the boundaries of your skin. And so the world becomes this wondrous place, I keep saying, to play in or to interact in. It's just a much more dynamic way of being in the world. But you have to go through, you have to agree to look at this thing called self.
That wonderful image of you meditating in the midst of these accordion books of your family over many generations, which was taken by Rob, won the National Portrait Prize, Photographic Portrait Prize. Tell me about Rob, Lindy. What drew you to him when you met?
It's okay. So Rob was also a Zen student, and for the first 3 Zen retreats that I sat on, in Zen you don't choose where you're going to sit during the week of retreat. You're placed. So anyway, I kept getting placed next to this guy, this man. And, you don't talk to each other. So, it's like, okay, this is curious, whatever. But after the 3rd time, we both looked at each other and said, well, who are you? We've been placed together, Anyway, we just started to talk. It turned out he moved to Lilyfield and I lived in Glebe, which is, the next suburb. We had a cup of coffee and then he moved in and then we got married.
It's the perfect Zen dating story.
Yeah.
What role did he have in your work? Tell me about the way the two of you collaborated.
Rob was very, very talented. He was a great musician. He could write. Actually, the problem with Rob is that he could do too many things and that confused him. But Rob also, one of his many talents was he was a master printer, digital printer. And when I was doing the early works with images, and I was using this clapped-out photocopier that had already done 1 million copies before I'd bought it. So that's how clapped out it was. But it was fantastic. It did exactly, because it was so crappy, it would smudge, it would do all these really exciting things, which I loved. It's the accident again, But it died. And then Rob just said, I think we can emulate this. Shall we have a go? And so he started to help me with the printing and the images. And, Rob was a great photographer, a really, really good photographer. So he would often help to take images, photos of work. And so we worked in this way. And so we kind of mutually worked with each other in our own individual practices.
He passed away just last year. What's helped you in your grief?
I wasn't expecting this question, but it's a good question. The beauty of Zen practice is that it's an invitation to deeply experience your life, not to evade it. And I certainly can produce many ways to evade difficult situations. But Zen kind of helps to soften the heart and allows you to hold things that perhaps you didn't think you felt able to. There was a great Zen master, Huineng, and one of my favourite quotes from him, and I'm going to misquote him, but it goes something like this. there are bushes and grasses, stars, planets, mountains, rivers, good people, bad people, fantastic teachings, bad teachings. Every single one of these things is your original face. Every single one of these things makes what you are. Compassion is your capacity to hold everything, you know, the good, the bad, the delightful. But that compassion that allows you to hold even the most difficult and painful thing, if you can look at it and be with it with great tenderness, that's the thing that's going to help you through life. But it's also that if you can look at this in your own soul, then it's possible that maybe when you look at another soul, that empathy and connection is also going to be there in that relationship too. So, you know, it's just this, because Zen is the practice of just being open to every moment of your existence and not being afraid of that. Or if you are afraid, then saying, oh God, I'm so afraid of that. And that's cool, that's okay. But, you know, death is going to happen to all of us. And the difficulty of loving somebody is that you will lose them. But to create a heart that's generous enough to hold everything is the only game in town, actually.
Given that you worked together so closely, is the studio a happy place for you at the moment, or is it a bit bittersweet to be in that studio space without him?
Well, initially, you know, it was extremely painful to be there without him because my studio is adjacent to the house that we lived in. And, it sounds kind of naff, but it isn't if you experience it. As the time goes on, you know, I'm walking around the garden and the memories of Rob, you know, that the house that we moved to 7 years ago really was our forever home. So everything reminds me of him. So there's a kind of transition of that when grief is so raw, it's like breathing razor blades. And isn't it a miracle how it softens and transforms to an appreciation and a bathing in the spirit and the beauty of what you had and you continue to have.
He was a great dog lover, and you've got a number of Scottish Terriers. What kind of friends have they been to you over the last year?
Oh, they are the most ratbag Rastafarian Scotty dogs. They're fabulous. Rob's great love, in his greatest love, was his dogs. And he took some amazing photographs of them. It's a very Rob and Lindy thing, just to be laughing at the dogs all the time, because you've got 4 stubby little dogs who've got egos as big as and who but are just hilarious. They're just, I don't know, they're just funny.
You're in the process, Lindy, of working on a very big project for the National Gallery. What's it going to look like when it's finished?
It'll be based on the idea of a snake swallowing its own tail. So it's going to be called Ouroboros. So it's a spiral, basically. So there's a spiral and the tail of the spiral actually enters the mouth of the beast. So it will be 4.2 metres tall, I think either 8 or 10 metres wide. Okay, so it's basically the size of a small house. It will be stainless steel and mirror polished. So what will happen is that in the daytime it will receive the imagery of the world, okay, on that highly polished stainless steel. So it receives the imagery of, passers-by, clouds, birds, traffic, all that sort of stuff. So life is sort of enlivening it. It'll also be perforated with about 100,000 million little holes. And at night it'll be internally lit and there'll be light sort of bleeding out to the world. So the way I like to think about it is that during the day it's receiving the imagery of the world, and at night it's returning energy and light back to the world.
It seems to echo with that description of self that you were describing earlier. It's a few years yet before it's installed.
2 more years.
Two more years. And do things feel on track for such a big project?
Yes, just today I had a very long meeting about the engineering of the project. It's a massive job. To explain it, it's like this 13-tonne object anchored to the ground only in one place, so it's cantilevered. It has no internal structure, so it has to be holding itself up. The engineering of it is award-winning.
The scale and the vision that you have for this work, it feels like you've well and truly left behind any questions or imposter syndrome or anxiety you had in the start of your career when you're photocopying bits of Western art. You just feels like this is such a powerful statement of presence.
Thank you, it is. I hope it is. That's so good. Thank you.
If you look back over your career to this point, how do you feel about where things are at for you in terms of what you're making in the world, right back to that little 3-year-old lying on a tummy noticing the dust motes in the sunlight, to someone who's creating this engineering marvel of reflection and light? What comes up for you when you think about that journey?
Oh, what a journey, because the self-doubt was enormous. Have you any idea? Oh, my God. But somewhere along the line, maybe it's age, maybe it's Zen practice, maybe it's all of this stuff, or maybe it's just maturity. You just realise you can only be what you are, whatever that is. And on the entrances of a lot of Zen temples in the world is something like, only enter if you are unafraid to meet yourself. And that's truly what Zen practice is. And I'm not trying to proselytise or anything. But I think what's happened for me was this extreme self-doubt. I was almost suicidal with this self-doubt because I just did not know how I could fit in. And so it's grown, it's changed, and I guess it's blossomed into this just acceptance that I can never step outside the web of cosmos. None of us can. Each of us is an integral part and holds up the sky in our own way. And that, no matter where that position is and what you are in that, is a beautiful and glorious thing to do. You cannot extricate yourself from the web and the matrix of this. So, and because you can't, then enjoy it. I'm just enjoying it now.
Lindy Lee, I've so enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you so much for being my guest on Conversations.
Thanks, Sarah. You're great to talk to.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Kanoski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.
Remember a time when you had one good outfit? Now the average Australian buys 56 items of clothing a year. And it feels like we're on a fast fashion treadmill that's kind of hard to get off. So, how did we get here? I'm Veronica Milsom, host of Threads, the podcast that undresses the fast fashion industry. From the marketing tricks that are being used on us right now,
they're going to use social media to hunt down their prey.
Bang, 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 bang.
To the lies.
So greenwashing is a marketing strategy that gives you a reason to buy.
Threads. It's everything fast fashion doesn't want you to know. Threads. Hear it in the ABC Listen app.